My name is Jillian Berman. I'm a reporter at MarketWatch, where I write about student debt and college affordability. Quick plug, if you have any ideas on those topics, please come see me afterwards. And today we're here to talk about a very important and sometimes misunderstood topic in the higher education landscape, minimizing the risk of borrowing for education. And we have some great panelists here. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then let them give a more full introduction of themselves and talk a little bit about the perspective that they bring. So we have Beth Akers, who's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and she is the co-author of the recently published Game of Loans, a book about the rhetoric and reality surrounding student debt. We have Jesse O'Connell, who is a strategy officer at the Lumina Foundation, and Kevin Fudge, the Ombudsman and Director of Consumer Advocacy at ASA. So yeah, if you guys could just talk for a minute or two about your work, that would be great. So let's start with Beth.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here today and giving me the chance to be in your ear for a few minutes. I'm an economist by training, and by practice I've been studying higher education finance and particularly student debt. A lot of my research has been in exploring the notion of a crisis in student lending, essentially pushing back on the rhetoric, which I feel is largely void of facts, and filling that up with some empirical research and findings that can really paint an accurate picture of what's happening in the student loan market. And so I was thrilled to be on a panel to discuss risk, because I think framing the issue of college affordability in risk through this lens is completely the correct way to be thinking about it. And I can go into more detail as we progress through the panel, but thank you for having me.
So I just want to start by sharing briefly why Lumina thinks this notion of risk in post-secondary education matters. And it matters because, as we heard a little bit on that opening panel, the stakes have changed, dramatically. Right now and into the foreseeable future, post-secondary education is the path to the middle class and for a good job. The Georgetown Center on Education in the Workforce tells us that by the end of the decade, 2/3 of all jobs are going to require some form of post-secondary credential. And we could also frame that relative to the declining value of a high school education. Back in 1973, if you didn't have a high school diploma, you were eligible for 1/3 of jobs, but today, that's dropped to 1 in 10. So it's imperative that our post-secondary system is designed so that we have productive outcomes as much as possible. So at Lumina, we want 60% of Americans to have a high-quality post-secondary degree or certificate by the year 2025. And we feel like that's how we're going to ensure that our country has the talent it needs for a thriving economy and for individuals to have ample opportunity available to them. So just an update on where we are in terms of making progress towards that goal. So in 2014, 40.4% of Americans have at least a 2-year degree. And if we include high-quality certificates, that's 4.9%. So we get to kind of just a hair over 45% of Americans. And about half of states have announced their own attainment goals that they're working towards, but none of us, not Lumina at a national level, not any individual state, is going to get to that goal and sort of provide the building blocks for that 21st century economy that we need if our post-secondary system is viewed as unacceptably risky and unacceptably unaffordable. So I'm excited that we're here today to talk about this issue more in depth.
Hi, good afternoon. So my evolution in this, I've been kind of every place in the educational system. So a teacher in K-12, 15 years ago, it's a long time now. Don't let my boyish looks fool you. Was in admissions and financial aid at a small liberal arts college, so got to see sort of the application process, financial aid, and then to now sort of moving from direct service to looking at overarching issues, looking at this idea of has the risk sort of outweighed the reward? In other words, in this region with so many different options and choices for people, we are correct in promoting post-secondary educational opportunities for individuals, but have we, in some instances, oversold it? And have our people adequately addressing the new risk-reward dynamic? For example, just to use an anecdote again, it's not evidence of any larger trend, but I worked with a young woman several years ago who got into a small private liberal arts college in the city, in Boston, and then one of the state universities here. And there was a significant gap between what she received in financial aid and what the school cost at the private school. And so I believe, if I remember the numbers correctly, she came from a family of 3. The mother, she made $15,000 a year. And so the student had a full ride, meaning that she had no balance from the public institution, and yet she had a $30,000 gap roughly at the private institution. And the guidance counselor at her high school was saying, based on all the evidence and the $1 million more you earn in your future from your bachelor's, you should go to this private school because it's an investment in your future. And maybe not necessarily adequately weighing the risk, particularly if the student had the option to go to a public institution and pay nothing out of pocket, literally. And so the young woman came to me in August after she already deposited at the private institution and said, I appreciate what my guidance counselor has said, but after kind of reviewing the situation with my mom, I really want to go to the public school. Since my mom only makes $15,000, can you help me get the $600 back that I deposited to reserve my spot in the private liberal arts college? To me, it's a simple no-brainer, okay? The student looked at the options, made the reasonable choice, the one with the least amount of risk, and when I communicated that to the private school, they kind of double down. They're like, well, we might be able to give her like $5,000 more in grant, but here's, and if we sign our parent up for a plus loan of $20,000, then, we can fill the gap with another 5 and this, that, and the other. And I said, I'm sorry, did you not understand that she only made $15,000 in a year and you want to give her a plus loan in excess of that? And the school mentality is, well, this is a student that's already deposited. We want that student to matriculate, and they're not really weighing the risk involved of that decision. And so the onus was entirely on the student. And so we got to a place eventually where I convinced the gentleman who I was speaking with that this may not be in the student's best interest. I realize that you want to help, but your help actually might be doing more harm than good. And so eventually, over the course of months, was able to then convince the school to return the $600 to the student, and then she successfully matriculated at the state college and was fully funded. And then, I checked in with her last year, and she had made Dean's List and was progressing. But I think that case sort of illustrates, particularly here in Boston, where we have that dynamic, the challenges that we face in understanding how risk-reward sort of plays out here. Recently I was in Kansas City, and so, in Kansas they might have 20 colleges in the entire state. So, and the idea of going to public versus private people celebrate if kids get into K-State or University of Kansas. Whereas here in the Northeast, you go down Beacon Street and there's 20 colleges right there, right? So it's looking at this from a national context and understanding the challenge that we face, looking at this problem in the bigger picture, but also understanding, well, how is it on the micro level here in our communities, whether that's Boston, whether that's New York, whether that's DC, and really sort of educating not just ourselves, but the people that are involved in this process. So like the guidance counselors who are in K-12, parents, employers. Like it's really bringing this awareness that yes, it is an investment of your future, but it is fraught with risk. And how do we minimize that for borrowers who might be most affected by if they get the bet wrong? And I think Beth can talk about that in more detail as we get going.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you guys. And we will open it up for questions, towards the end. So please, if you have them, there will be people circulating. You can write them down or just speak into the mic as well. So I think, this was discussed a little bit on the previous panel, but we hear a lot of stories about student loan borrowers, particularly young adults, struggling with the debt they have, maybe regretting the decision that they made. And then we kind of hear that it wasn't always this way, that when my parents went to college, right, they were able to work their way through school. If you dropped out, it wasn't great, but it wasn't, such a big financial hardship. Can you guys, sort of walk us through how we got to the point that we're at now where going to college can be a big financial risk? And Beth, I know in the book you talk a little bit about this, so maybe if you want to start.
Sure. So, we've all heard the numbers over and over regarding how much debt has increased over time. We have more total outstanding debt. We have more households as a percent of total households holding debt, and each of those households mathematically speaking, also has more debt. And so we tend to, off the bat, think, well, clearly this is a bad thing, and there are ways in which this is a bad thing, but it's important to sort of break down where that change is coming from. As researchers have looked at this question of what is driving this increase in debt that we've observed over time, there are a few factors that sort of stand out. The first one you would probably guess is tuition. So we've seen tuition grow sort of without explanation at a dramatic clip over the past few decades. It's been the fastest pace of inflation out of any other industry in the U.S. economy, with healthcare coming in pretty far behind it in terms of inflation in that market. That increase has explained about 50% of the increase in debt that we've seen over time. So when we think about the reasons for debt to increase and some being good and some being bad, it's hard to think that increase being driven by price tag alone is a good thing. On the flip side, there are good reasons for debt to be increasing. We recognize broadly that investments in higher education have a very large return both to the individual and to society. At an individual level, where estimates suggest it's about a 15% rate of return if you complete a bachelor's or an associate's degree. So we recognize that these are wise investments. So part of the increase is actually being driven by the fact that people are obtaining higher levels of education than they were before, and more people are obtaining some level of education, which means they're dipping into debt as an instrument for paying for that. And it's great that we have this instrument. About a quarter of the increase in the debt that we've seen over the past 20 years can be explained by those two factors. So the increases in educational attainment. So again, just kind of backing out, there's a lot of other unexplained types of behavior. We know anecdotally people were previously borrowing from the equity out of their home in order to find money to make investments in higher education. Very recently, that changed, and people were just not able to do that as readily, and so that's caused people to shift more from an out-of-pocket sort of payment to financing as a means of paying for higher education. So a lot of dynamics happening. Not all of them are necessarily sort of crisis-evoking, but a complicated situation.
So Jillian, I'm actually going to take a slightly different track. You said young adults, but I want to point out some things about today's college students. So 38% of college students today are older than 25. 58% are working full-time while going to school, and 26% have children of their own. And overall, 47% of today's students are supporting themselves financially. So when we talk about what has changed, one of the things that has changed is fundamentally who we think of when we think of someone pursuing post-secondary education has changed. Students have responsibilities and obligations that go beyond the classroom, and many of those responsibilities and obligations come with costs of their own. And to some extent, I don't know that all of us broadly, institutions, states, have done a good job accounting for what this full cost of living looks like and how to ensure consistent access to the types of benefits that can help today's college students meet this full suite of needs. Because we know, and this has been studied, when students run into some of these barriers of the broader aspects of their life, that is often the point where stop-out occurs. And something that I know we'll visit at some point on this panel is that non-completion is what's driving sort of issues around student debt as much as anything else. So if we know that our students are older, we know that they have obligations, we know that those barriers are sort of not maybe being addressed as we best can, that in turn is driving this sort of completion issue, which then contributes to this notion of risk in the system.
Right. Yeah, just to piggyback on that, it's interesting because it's like, well, what's changed? But it's almost like the people might be questioning that sort of blind faith that if you go to school, like everything will work out. And as we are, just to give you an example of how the shift has gone. So here in Massachusetts, there was a drive a few years ago to make sure that early childhood educators were certified, meaning that they at least had an associate's degree in early childhood development, which would therefore then, you could say, whatever facility had a certain amount of people that were certified, and then therefore would get accrediting standards, and then you have overall increased childcare, which leads to better outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. What happened was, as they as they encouraged more people to go back to school, they found that many early childhood educators had been in default previously from previous attempts to go through school. So it's like you have this scholarship program designed to support people returning back to school, but yet they can't take advantage of it because they're in defaulted loans. So they have defaulted loans. So it's almost like it's an unintended consequence of a policy that then you say, oh, well, we didn't know this problem existed. And then that leads to further investigation. Well, how far widespread does this issue reach? Is it just a question of people having debt and not able to repay? Or how does it impact other, like the previous panel talked about, other unexpected industry? And so, so much of the coverage, I think the statistic is, 70% of the stories that you may see in any given news cycle about student loan debt, the people that are being interviewed or the people that are being covered have in excess of $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. When in fact, the majority, what is it, like 40% of people have $10,000 or less? And so but what the real issue is the people who have anywhere between 1,000 and 5,000 who have a 22% default rate. And the people who start but don't finish. And so now as that's sort of becoming into the research is sort of catching up with what people who have been practitioners on the ground have seen, now you're sort of having the data catch up with like the anecdote, and then it's like, okay, well now how do we really address this? So I think that's what's changed for the positive. And so it's like we're saying these ideas exist on the same plane. We have a challenge with student loan debt, and college is worth it. We're not saying that one cancels out the other. We're saying that college is worth it if you finish and if you're able to take advantage of that degree. But then for people who make the attempt and try, what happens? Just to give you an example, and we have risk in everyday life, right? We have risk all the time. I mean, just earlier today, like I risked a ticket because I parked illegally in order to get sushi for Jillian and myself, right? Seriously, literally. Like I was on Irving Street, right? And so, the guy's like, oh, 15 minutes, so I'm there, and I'm like, okay, dude, 15 minutes? Come on, we gotta go. And so, like, 20 minutes later, I come out, we're trying to move our car, and, like, I get a $75 ticket. I took a risk.
That's expensive sushi.
It is expensive sushi. It's good, worth it. But so I made that risk, and I deal with the consequences, but I'm out $75, If a student takes a risk and they have a $15,000 gap, semester by semester, that's $7,500 a semester, they try to go, they may have financial aid, but they try to go, and they fail on that risk, well, now they're out $7,500. And now how do you mitigate for that? And I think that's sort of where we're at, because we want the system to work. We want college to work for everybody who makes that attempt. But as we've seen, in certain sectors of of higher ed, for-profit being one of them, some are higher risk than others, and it creates challenges.
Can I add one more thing there?
Sure.
So, I think those are really, really great points, and it prompts me to think of this another way, which is, you asked about, this, it wasn't always this way, right? Our parents always tell us, I was able to work my way through college, and, senators are notorious for saying that as well. But it's true, and I like to say it's not the cost so much that's the problem, it's the risk, because if we have the price tag has increased, but the financial returns are still there for it, then the price tag doesn't so much matter. What matters if you've made that investment and it doesn't pay off, as Kevin was highlighting. And what's happening is that previously we were putting a small amount of eggs in one basket, right? Drop the basket, eggs split, that's okay, right? Now we're telling young people, in order to make this investment in higher education, you need to put tons and tons and tons of eggs into this one basket because the price tag has gotten so high. So to me, that's what's changed, is that the risk as a portion of your livelihood and your lifetime wealth or annual income is just increased dramatically. And so the risk situation is a situation when previously it wasn't.
Right.
Like Kevin was saying, we face these small risks all the time, yet this is a big one.
Or even bigger risks. Like, for example, you might decide, you know what, I'd like to build my house on the Cape, and I want to build it on the water. So what am I going to do? I'm going to buy flood insurance, so in case the perfect storm happens, which was 25 years ago this week, if the perfect storm 2 occurs, then my house gets wiped out, but I can rebuild because I have flood insurance. Now, it may have gone up, obviously, exponentially since then, but at least you have some sort of insurance. And I think we do have some insurance built into the system with income-driven plans, with public service loan forgiveness, but is that enough? And is there enough of a buffer to help people in those situations? And we talk about who assumes if we're going to shift the conversation and who assumes the risk, the college, if they might make the argument, well, we're taking a risk on having that student because it's not good for us if the student matriculates but then leaves, because then our retention numbers are low and that doesn't reflect well on us. Well, you still got paid. I mean, and to be blunt, I'm not saying that those aren't concerns about retention, but in actuality, like, you're looking at percentages where people are dealing with real dollars. And I think there's a little bit of a difference as well with that.
Yeah, and so, I mean, getting into that question of sort of mitigating the risk and who assumes the responsibility for that, right? I think, I'm a personal finance reporter, which to me is like a combination of educating individuals so they have the right information, but also kind of, beating down on the powers that be to make it better for, to make the system better for those individuals. So, I mean, how much of a responsibility do families have in this situation? Do students have? How much of a responsibility do, policymakers and colleges and, and all of that? How much, what role do they play in this? And if we assume that families do have some responsibility, is there enough information out there for them to make the right decision?
I think we've sort of collectively decided that we don't wish for today's students to face the full risk of what it takes to make an investment in higher education. And I say that because we have support on, I think, both sides of the aisle for income-driven repayment of some form. And we call it income-driven repayment because it's really a set of, somebody said the number in the previous panel, but some ridiculous high number of different programs that mishmash together to get this safety net for borrowers. So we all believe in a sense that this should exist. The optimal level of that insurance will probably vary depending on who you're speaking to, and we'll absolutely never come to agreement. I wouldn't even want to take a guess as to what the optimal level should be. But what we can all come together on, I think, is the idea that we want to take this mess and tangle of programs and refine it so it's actually accessible. The solution to me is not to get more information into the hands of the students so that they can navigate the current system better, but to reform the system so that even with limited information, which we know is how students make decisions, they can get the benefit of the safety nets that exist and that people want them to be able to access.
Yeah, I think all that's right. I'll offer a counterpoint, and obviously the title of this summit is a summit about solutions. So I think what I'm going to offer next, I would hope, is a solution, maybe not the solution, but certainly something for consideration. So in his opening remarks, Kevin talked about this notion of gaps in financial aid and how that often drives risky decisions or suboptimal decisions, or puts people in a situation where they feel forced to make a choice that they know ultimately might sort of not have a great outcome. And I think it is the existence of those gaps that really is driving a lot of this particular conversation around student debt. So last fall, Lumina set out to consider a model of affordability that's sort of premised on what students and families can reasonably contribute, and then have the system kind of meet them where they are. So this proposal came out of a bunch of conversations that we had throughout 2015 with both higher education experts, but also experts in other social policy fields, because our sort of starting premise was there are benchmarks of affordability in other social policy areas. In housing policy, we generally hold that 30% of your discretionary income should go to pay for housing. In healthcare, it's about 7 or 8% of your discretionary income should go towards healthcare. But when it comes to college affordability, we kind of use that old, like, I'll know it when I see it method, and that means something different to everyone else. So without this shared acceptance or agreement around what we mean when we talk about college affordability, we're never actually going to get anywhere, particularly when we pursue kind of these big policy ideas. So we put forth an idea that college is affordable if you can pay for it with 10% of your discretionary income saved over 10 years, combined with 10 hours of work while you're in school. And I should point out that 10 hours of work is actually a cap on work. Most students right now work closer to an average of 20 hours a week while they're in school. But one of the reasons that we sort of approach this, and it goes to what Beth just mentioned, is there is a sense of like shared responsibility in there. We're saying if you can save, we set discretionary income at 200% of poverty. So if you can save, you should be saving something. You should work some while you're in school. But then in return for doing that, the system needs to meet you at that contribution. We need to move past saying this is your EFC and that number just doesn't mean anything. And so we've had this conversation throughout this past year, and we found that this idea has resonated with people. I don't know that it's something that we can just like up and implement tomorrow, but this notion of beating down on that gap and actually meeting students and families where they are, I think is an important thing that gets at that fundamental concern that people have, that they know post-secondary education is necessary, but they likewise feel that it's unaffordable, and that kind of leaves them caught between a rock and a hard place. So we just need to get to this sense where we have a sense of college affordability that's clear and predictable, built around that defined benefit, and then based on a reasonable contribution of what students and families can contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in addition to what the great work that Lumen is doing about raising the awareness about what does affordability mean, it's also then conveying those messages to the people involved in education when it comes to the metrics by which secondary school administrators are measured on. So for example, a couple years ago, I was giving a talk at a high school on the South Shore of Boston about, it was their financial aid night, and I was explaining how you can actually save by starting at a 2-year school and then transferring to a 4-year school, and the benefits associated with that, and then perhaps maybe you have more resources left over for graduate study or for buying a home, things like that. And the principal of the school was sitting in the back. And meanwhile, so there's probably like 150 parents, a few students, and then the principal and the 2 guidance counselors, and the principal's in the back, and he's just shaking his head. He's like, no. And when I spoke to the guidance counselors after the presentation, I said, did I say something untoward, or what was possibly offensive in that? Because he looked, like he just ate a bitter pill. Seriously, the look on his face, like a kid with Brussels sprouts, right? And so I said, they said, well, he just found the idea of our students going to 2-year school. He didn't like that because he wants more of our students to go to a 4-year school. We like to advertise in our profile that we have X percentage, hopefully upwards of 85 to 88 to 90% of our students going to a 4-year school. And what's interesting is that that metric holds it holds more weight than affordability. So for example, I'm not going to get into the whole charter debate here. I will say that one aspect of charter schools that you might find interesting is how they tout that they send 100% of their students onto 4-year schools, or they have 100% graduation rate, 100% of their students go on to 4-year schools, as if that's sort of a measure of the quality of instruction and learning that's going on in the charter environment. So I said to myself a few years ago, I was like, well, that's great, but are they getting through, and how much debt are they taking on by going to these schools? And so I actually did a crack study. It wasn't as extensive as Beth's work. My doctorate.
Few things are.
No, few things are. It's hard to hold a candle to that. But out of all the graduates, so I took all the graduates' financial aid awards and where they were going to matriculate. So I found that 70% of the students and the majority of them were Pell eligible, their average cumulative debt potentially at graduation would be $60,000. If you took the gaps in their financial aid from their first year, now granted, like some of them could be RAs and like they save on room and board, some of them could rock out in college and then make Dean's List and get scholarships. So that it was just purely speculative. But if we're talking about affordability right off the bat, and we're looking at what's affordable over the long term, it's important to take that into consideration. And the idea that the majority of the students were Pell eligible, and that the affordability was not even on the radar of the guidance counselor. When I was sort of bringing that to the conversation, I was talking with parents, and I was like, how do you propose to fill this gap? Well, we just will. I'm like, all right, well, this is your first student going to school. You have 3 more behind. What is your plan for them? And sort of you see the light bulb go off, and it's like, oh wait, I have to think about this in a broader context. So it's multifaceted, the challenge of not only do we have to bring this idea of affordability again, in the policy arena, but it's also once we do that, then how do you disseminate that information to people who are on the ground working with students and families, and not just again in K-12. We have people here from economic empowerment organizations like Compass Working Capital or Versum, where they're talking about savings. Those are the type of conversations that they can have too on that level, and because that needs to be part of the lexicon just as much as college is worth it, because when you don't have the other components of the discussion, then you're not giving the complete picture and allowing people to make informed choices.